As you can see today, I am in a different rocking chair, if you can call it that. Yes, a swing chair. And today we will look at the following question. What would happen if China attacked Taiwan to return the ship to its home harbor, just as Putin once returned Crimea to the Russian harbor? I will not consider direct United States involvement in this war right now, because America could win this war without entering it. Yes, America will have to make some sacrifices, but these sacrifices will not be the lives of American soldiers, but merely the inconvenience of its citizens, and only temporarily. However, thanks to these sacrifices, China will be completely crushed. The political regime in China will be changed from within, and China will turn into Japan. Does America have any problems with Japan? What is needed for this? First, we need to wait for China to attack Taiwan. If that happens, consider America lucky. The tiger has fallen into a trap. Second, on that very same day, America must ban the import of all products from China. I repeat, all imports. Yes, this will strike back at America, but I think that America will somehow survive without Chinese underwear. But China will collapse without American money, because the bulk of China's economy, the lion's share of China's economy, relies on American money. It is an export economy. China is not self-sufficient. It cannot sustain domestic demand for its own products and its own labor force, which is far more important. China only exists because America and Europe exist, the two main markets for Chinese goods. You might ask, why did I call a Chinese attack on Taiwan a gift for America? Well, because China might not even attack. When assessing the possibility of an attack on Taiwan, China will inevitably consider Russia's experience. And those who think that Putin, and I quote, broke the global system of agreements and set a bad example for other dictators on how to solve territorial problems are mistaken. Putin really did set a bad example back then, but not in the sense that bad boys now have a free hand, but quite the opposite. Here is the first lesson. The lesson from Saddam Hussein, who seized Kuwait, considering it to be historical Iraqi land. This lesson has been forgotten, but Putin refreshed it. History has often shown that a small, victorious war ends in a heavy defeat for those who counted on a quick, brilliant blitzkrieg. And now China cannot help but project this experience onto itself. Especially since it is separated from Taiwan by the sea, and crossing a water barrier is one of the most complex military operations. The Normandy landings only succeeded because the Allies managed to deceive Hitler, right? About the landing site. In the modern world, you cannot hide troop concentrations for an attack, thereby exposing those troops to a preemptive strike, right? Nor can you hide the landing site in this case. It is known, the small island of Taiwan. And the fate of the cruiser Moskva, which was sunk by a missile, right? A missile that cost orders of magnitude less than the cruiser. Comrade Xi cannot help but be concerned by this. He understands that if a blitzkrieg gets bogged down, if the war drags on, he faces Russia's fate. A failed blitzkrieg is effectively a defeat. And this is not even my opinion. It was recently stated by one of the most fierce Z-patriots, a Russian writer named Zakhar Prilepin. He said that Russia, in its current state, is incapable of defeating Ukraine in this war. Here is a literal quote from Prilepin. At this stage, the Russia we have built cannot win this war. End of quote. And who is we? That is Zakhar Prilepin and Putin. So the Russia that writer Prilepin and President Putin built together cannot win, according to writer Prilepin. And note, this is not me, a right-wing liberal, saying this. This is what left-wing conservative Prilepin, a national socialist and red-brown imperialist, is saying. Accordingly, Chairman Xi is not at all eager to find himself in the same situation, where everyone says, the vast China that Chairman Xi and the writer, who is it, Liu Cixin, have built, cannot defeat the tiny island of Taiwan, especially since the Chinese, as everyone knows, are not exactly great warriors, right? They couldn't even defeat tiny Vietnam back in the day, even though they didn't have to cross any bodies of water. And the same thing was recently said by the Bulboführer President Lukashenko, that Russia cannot win this war and needs to make peace. Besides, one should not forget that China's foreign exchange reserves are not just gold, but also currency in American bonds. And these currency reserves could face the same fate that awaited the 300 billion belonging to Russia. Except China has not 300 billion, but nearly 700 billion in its currency reserves. It would be a shame to lose them. And now let's talk about the details. So, on the second day after China attacks Taiwan, America declares a total blockade of all its goods. Hypothetically, right? One could make an exception for strategic goods needed by America, but China itself would cut them off from the States. So, it is politically more correct to refuse, to show one's principles, to refuse everything. What exactly does this step threaten America with, and what does it threaten China with? Let's start with America. Yes, it will hurt, but it won't be fatal. Besides underwear and t-shirts, America imports some critical goods from China that it doesn't produce or only produces in small quantities. I will list the main ones now. Batteries of all kinds, including those for Tesla, right? Rare earth metals for the production of magnets, electric motors, and all other defense equipment. Pharmaceutical ingredients for their own pharmaceutical industry. It is huge in America.
Well, there's also electronics, smartphones, and so on. Is it possible to live without Chinese smartphones, using only, say, Korean or Indian ones, if you replace them not every 2 years but every 5? Easily. It's not the first time Americans have had to endure. I'll remind you that during the Second World War, cars were not sold to private individuals in America, nor were they produced. The last civilian cars were produced in early February 1942. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, they stopped producing passenger cars for the public and began making tanks, trucks, jeeps, aircraft engines, planes, and ammunition. So, for 2.5 years, until about September of 1945, practically no new cars were produced for private buyers in the States. They survived. Can America endure 2.5 years? As we can see, history shows that it can. Some people have surely recalled Trump's concern about rare earth metals, which Trump even wanted to mine in Russia, Ukraine, and even in frozen Greenland. And people are thinking now, aha, there it is, America's critical dependency. Nothing of the sort. First of all, the volumes of consumption of these metals are relatively small. Secondly, they can be bought in Australia, in Canada, in the States themselves, in Russia itself, and in Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia would only be happy to have American investments. Yes, it will take, say, a couple of extra years for production to ramp up, but once the production of these metals is up and running, China will lose the market, because America will be mining these metals, well, at its own plants in Russia or in Ukraine. The short-term inconvenience for the United States with rising prices for these metals will turn into a long-term failure for China, because competing production will emerge that did not exist before, and the entire market, even after the war, will not return to China. And where will the investments for rare earth metal mining come from? They will appear due to the rise in prices for rare earth metals. The market will regulate itself. That is how the capitalist economy works. It is automatic. What else is there? Pharmaceuticals, right? Yes, American pharmaceutical companies, which pay huge, sometimes multi-billion-dollar fines almost every year for poisoning Americans with their drugs, are critically dependent on Chinese imports. Here, by the way, are the fine amounts for American pharmaceutical companies over the last 30 years. In total, just over 3 years, from 2018 to 2021, American Big Pharma paid almost $24 billion to Americans harmed by them. Will Americans suffer from a sharp reduction in medicine? Well, global statistics show that during doctors' strikes, when they perform fewer surgeries and prescribe fewer drugs, the mortality rate drops rather than rises. This paradox is hard to believe, but it is a fact. Mortality in the absence of doctors can drop by up to 30%. That is the statistic. I repeat, you can check it yourself. For instance, in Los Angeles in 1976, during a major doctors' strike, the mortality rate among the population dropped by 18%. Similar figures were recorded in South America, in Israel, and in Europe. Why does this happen? Because surgeons start performing fewer unnecessary elective surgeries that they profit from, and physicians start prescribing fewer drugs, because all drugs are toxins of varying lethality. In other words, during an embargo on all Chinese goods, fewer Americans will die. But I believe that is a minor tragedy. They will literally survive. Nevertheless, for the American economy, the drop in drug sales and the losses for pharmaceutical companies are indeed a very unpleasant matter. But a reduction in Chinese pharmaceutical ingredient supplies would be a real gift for India, which produces generics in huge quantities. India, which has tense relations with China, will be jumping for joy if it manages to redirect the American cash flow that used to go to China toward itself. Yes, bringing additional production capacity online will take some time, but China will lose the market forever. The green river of dollars will never fully return to China. America will just need to be patient for a while. What else? So, Chinese batteries for Tesla and the rest. I will tell you the truth. An electric car is a toy for California freaks. Real cowboys wear boots, hats, and drive big diesel engines. That is the real America. It lives in Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and Montana. Speaking of Montana, have you seen the show Yellowstone? If not, watch it. That is the America we all love. And California is just American socialist Europe, where people are fleeing from. So, what else do we have there? Modern chips from Taiwan. That is the most important thing. Yes, it will be very painful. Here it will suffer, or rather, the development of artificial intelligence will slow down. So, the automotive industry will suffer losses, the defense industry, the production of some medical equipment. But is it fatal? No, Taiwan is not the only place on the planet where chips are produced. South Korea produces chips. Europe, the United States, Japan produce chips. Yes, Taiwan has the lion's share of the market, but the most important thing is that they have advanced production. 90% of the most modern chips are produced in Taiwan. Now let us conduct a thought experiment. Suppose a large meteorite hit this Taiwanese production facility and destroyed it, along with, say, half of the island of Taiwan. Would the entire human civilization really perish because of this? Well, of course not. We would have to switch for a while to less advanced chips, which would become a bit more expensive, and that is all. How long would that take? Well, according to experts, the recovery would take from 1 year, which I do not really believe, to several years. But that is a small price to pay. This 5-year slowdown in electronics progress is a small price to pay for crushing a geopolitical rival. China will lose more, which we will discuss now. Everything else that America will lose is less important. For instance, Turkey will gladly replace Chinese home appliances in America with its own. Just so you know, the Turkish Republic produces up to 25% of all European home appliances, washing machines, air conditioners, dishwashers, coffee makers, and everything else. The Turks will be overjoyed if their market grows by another 300 million people in America. They have spare production capacity and are ready to expand it to flood America with televisions, microwaves, kettles, electric grills, and so on. Half the appliances in my home are Turkish, and they work perfectly. Nothing breaks, and it costs less than Korean brands. The same applies to everything else. After all, they mostly import baseball caps, souvenirs, sneakers, golf balls, and underwear from China. You might say, well, Americans can't go without underwear for long. They won't have to for long. They'll manage for a bit, that's all. And then underwear will be brought to America from Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Brazil, and Uzbekistan, where they grow a huge amount of cotton, and those countries really need to find work for their people. Right now, Uzbeks are coming to Russia as migrant workers. So if they have jobs back home, they will be sewing clothes and eating plov without being away from their families. Brazil produces 16% of all the world's cotton. India, 29%. They can do more. And yet, there are favelas in Brazil. India also has a huge surplus of labor. India exports its labor force to Russia and Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine are fighting with their own citizens. They are suffering huge losses of the white population and are bringing in Indians, Pakistanis, and even Taliban Afghans because there is no one left to work in factories and repair roads. America will survive if it imposes a blockade on China. They have been through worse. It is enough to recall the oil crisis of the 70s, when the price of oil quadrupled overnight. It was a shock, and this shock only revitalized America and allowed it to restructure its entire automotive industry, putting it on a modern track. These kinds of stress tests are only beneficial. Whatever does not kill us makes us stronger. But China will be killed. Even now, China is standing on one leg with the other poised over an abyss. China's economy is balancing on the brink of catastrophe. Why? On one hand, over 40 years of capitalist development, wages in China have risen so much that, in this sense, China has already lost its appeal to investors. They began moving production on a massive scale, and not just of underwear, but also iPhones, from China to Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and India. This, by the way, helps develop the planet's backward regions, for which we thank the Americans. They are leveling the planet economically in this way. That is, on one hand. On the other hand, China's further economic development is hindered by an outdated political superstructure that contradicts the natural development of the economy. I phrase it like this: political lack of freedom stifles economic freedom. The pot is boiling, but it is clamped shut by an old political lid. The pot could explode, and China is on the verge of an explosion. The Communist Party of China, which long ago ceased to be communist, has simply become a sort of, nomenclatura aristocracy. It interferes in economic management, distorting and warping it. For the sake of triumphant reports, Chinese party officials in the provinces have been pouring billions of dollars into thin air. Nearby, on the border of two provinces, two international airports are being built, and neither one works because they have no economic viability. They were built for victory reports. In China, there are entire empty cities where no one lives. Factories are built that produce tens of thousands of cars that will never be sold. And all this is done only so that a party official can report to Beijing on the province's development and get a promotion, leaving all the problems to his successor. Economists know that if you liberalize only the economy while denying people political freedoms and keep the country under a rigid dictatorship, the economy will initially grow up to a certain ceiling, right? Then it will reach a plateau and stall. It will stop growing. If, after that, you grant people political freedoms in addition to economic ones, the economy will continue to grow to the level of developed countries. For this, you need independent courts that protect property rights, right? Freedom of the press, no censorship, and consequently, no ideology, which means a multi-party system. That is, political competition. These are all basics. Ideological societies do not grow economically beyond a certain ceiling, determined by an economic and political lid. The capitalist economy is automatic, and it does not tolerate manual control. It is like sticking an iron crowbar into an engine. Without any economic justification, just for the sake of reports and meeting quotas, China built so many steel, cement, and automotive plants that they can supply the entire world with their products. China can now produce more solar panels than the entire world needs, because the Central Committee of the Communist Party issued directives from above to develop this specific industry as the industry of the future. But the future is determined by the market, that is, the network function of the economy, and not by a party bureaucrat who reads something somewhere. But what the market needs, no one knows, except for the market itself. That is the nature of networked democratic management. Capitalism is an economic democracy where people vote with their rubles or dollars every day for specific goods and services. And in China, where management is hierarchical rather than networked, factories were built in various provinces that simply duplicated each other, and now they are forced to dump their products into the global economy at practically cost price, because China's domestic market is too small for such hyper-industrialization. This is industrial hypertension, and a stroke will happen soon. In China, the largest developers have already started going bankrupt. And construction is the driver of the Chinese economy. In China, they blow up and demolish entire neighborhoods because it is easier to tear them down than to maintain them. I emphasize, they are demolishing new buildings. At the same time, China is facing depopulation. Its population has begun to shrink, well, due to the demographic collapse of civilization. By the way, I have a whole series on my channel about the collapse of civilization, which I recommend you watch. If you haven't seen at least the first episode yet, right? Because it talks about things almost no one knows, and my story is based on historical material. We are not the first civilization to face this. I will try to provide a link somewhere here, if possible, and it will be in the description. Now in China, they have started talking about a shrinking workforce in the country and an increase in the number of pensioners. This is very alarming for the ruling regime of dictator Xi. But at the same time, educated Chinese youth who have graduated from universities are entering the labor market, and these people cannot find work. In China, the youth unemployment rate is reaching, how much would you think? 20%. 20%. And I want to note that Chinese youth cannot be compared to lazy, fat American youth. For Americans, college is just childhood extended for another 5 years. For 5 years in college, they smoke weed, drink beer, enjoy life, and over those 5 years, they take on crippling lifelong debt and earn a useless degree in something like women's studies or indigenous culture. In China, it is not like that at all. Chinese students work like dogs for 12 hours a day to get in. In college, they get real technical degrees, and then they cannot find a job. As a result, an entire generation has formed in China whose life philosophy is, I will just lie down and quietly rot. They no longer want to participate in the race, and not because they are tired, but because there is no race for them anymore. They are not needed by anyone. And if it weren't for the demographic decline, there would be even more such people among the youth, right? China's demographic extinction has even partially benefited China. It offsets youth unemployment. When the youth unemployment rate in China reached 21% in 2023, the Chinese ruling party stopped publishing these statistics for recalculation. Later, they recalculated and adjusted their counting methodology, and they still ended up with 17%. That is all they could manage to scrape together. 17% unemployment among Chinese youth. This means China is already unable to provide jobs for the rising generation. Their manufacturing is already moving to Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam. Their potential production capacity for many types of goods already exceeds global demand, so their companies are competing with each other just to survive. And there is not even a global recession yet. And the United States has not yet imposed sanctions on China, yes, in the form of a total ban on Chinese products for attacking Taiwan. Can you imagine what will happen in a country that is already hanging by a thread, that has gotten involved in a war where the coffins of Chinese grandfathers have started to arrive? And these Chinese grandfathers, right? They are the only child in the family. Today's Chinese soldier was born back when the totalitarian Chinese regime forbade having a second child. So, what will happen to the country's economy and its morale, to China's spirit, if China gets bogged down in a war and receives a knockout blow from the United States in the form of an export ban? Factories will shut down and millions of people will be thrown out onto the streets. And if, God forbid, Europe also joins this economic blockade, as they would not like a war over Taiwan either, then China will collapse instantly. And then, as a result of internal unrest, the power of the Chinese partycrats will inevitably crumble, and China itself will also almost inevitably fall apart. If the center weakens, the Uyghurs and Tibet will instantly leave, where they hate the central government, and Hong Kong will leave, and then the collapse could continue region by region. Guangdong and Shanghai, this highly industrialized region, which is the engine of the Chinese economy, could leave, because why should it feed the rest of China? Furthermore, Dongbei, the so-called Old China, which is now considered the equivalent of America's Rust Belt. Whether a civil war will break out there or not is hard to say. And we also need to consider a factor we haven't discussed today, the climate. We are currently living in the era of global warming, as is well known. And historical and climatic analysis shows that during cooling eras, large empires solidify and form, while in warming eras, large countries fall apart. China is a large country, and physics is against it. However, the influence of climate on the history of civilization is a topic for another time. Perhaps we will discuss that too, because during warming periods, large empires fall apart. And, by the way, Russia is also a large country,